protesters and organizations. Authorities. Supported by. In Thailand, protests began in early 2020 with demonstrations against the government of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha. They later expanded to include the unprecedented demands for reform of the Thai monarchy. The protests were initially triggered by the dissolution of the Future Forward Party in late February 2020, which was critical of Prayut, the changes to the Thai constitution in 2017 and the country's political landscape that it gave rise to. This first wave of protests was held exclusively on academic campuses and was brought to a halt by the COVID-19 pandemic. Protests resumed again on the 18th of July with a large demonstration organized under the Free Youth umbrella at the Democracy Monument in Bangkok. 3 demands were presented to the government of Thailand: the dissolution of parliament, ending intimidation of the people, and the drafting of a new constitution. The July protests were triggered by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and enforcement of the lockdown emergency decree and spread nationwide. On the 3rd of August, 2 student groups publicly raised demands to reform the monarchy, breaking a long taboo of publicly criticizing the monarchy. A week later, 10 demands for monarchy reform were declared. The 19th of September rally saw 20,000 to 100,000 protesters and has been described as an open challenge to King Vajiralongkorn. A government decision to delay voting on a constitutional amendment in late September fueled nearly unprecedented public Republican sentiment. Following mass protests on the 14th of October, a severe state of emergency was declared in Bangkok during the 15th to the 22nd of October, citing the alleged blocking of a royal motorcade. Emergency powers were extended to the authorities on top of those already given by the emergency decree since March. Protests continued despite the ban, prompting a crackdown by police on the 16th of October using water cannons. In November, the parliament voted to pass 2 constitutional amendment bills, but their content effectively shut down the protesters' demands of abolishing the Senate and reformation of the monarchy. Clashes between the protesters and the police and royalists became more prevalent and resulted in many injuries. The protesters were mostly students and young people without an overall leader. Apart from the aforementioned political demands, some rallies were held by LGBT groups who called for gender equality, as well as student groups who campaigned for reforming the country's education system. Government responses included filing criminal charges using the emergency decree, arbitrary detention and police intimidation, delaying tactics, the deployment of military information warfare units, media censorship, the mobilization of pro-government and royalist groups who have accused the protesters of receiving support from foreign governments or non-governmental organizations as part of a global conspiracy against Thailand, and the deployment of thousands of police at protests. The government ordered university chancellors to prevent students from demanding reforms to the monarchy and to identify student protest leaders. Protests since October, when the king had returned to the country from Germany, resulted in the deployment of the military, riot police, and mass arrests. House of Representatives diplomatic missions of, in Thailand passport visa requirements visa policy over the previous 90 years in Thailand. Elected governments have frequently been overthrown by military coups. 13 successful coups have occurred since the end of absolute rule in the Siamese Revolution of 1932. As head of the Royal Thai Army, Prayut Chan-o-cha instigated the most recent coup in 2014 and led the National Council for Peace and Order, the military junta which came to power following the coup. Prayut was eventually appointed Prime Minister, and the NCPO ruled the country for 5 years, during which political and civil rights were restricted, and economic inequality widened. A disputed referendum, widely called unfree and unfair, was held in 2016 to approve a new military-drafted constitution. Analysts have described the new constitution as favoring the military and disadvantaging large political parties. It includes a junta-appointed Senate, empowered to vote for the Prime Minister for 5 years, allowing the military to select 2 Prime Ministers in the future, and binds future governments to a 20-year national strategy roadmap laid down the NCPO, effectively locking the country into the period of military-guided democracy with a much reduced role for politicians at both national and local levels. Prayu's supporters make up a majority of parliament. The 2019 Thai general election, which was considered partly free and not fair, and as electoral authoritarianism, and has been described as a political ritual, nominally brought an end to the NCPO. But the political system continued in the form of a Myanmar-style civil militar